Welcome to This Catholic Life. Conversation about life's ups and downs, big and small, how we deal with every situation imaginable, whatever life throws at us, but still manage to be sensible, practical and joyful. Today's show, that sensible, practical and joyful, is going to come under the microscope because we're talking about marriage. Marriage matters. A conversation about family life in the world where Catholic life mixes with marriage and family and what matters about being Catholic in this sphere. I'm your host, Peter Holmes, and today I'm joined by Francine Pirola.
Hello, Peter. It's wonderful to be here.
It's excellent to have you on board. We've had many good conversations over the years, and I hope this will be just another one of them. Byron and Francine Pirola, I should mention, are directors of the Marriage Resource Centre and directors of Marriage Enrichment Seminar called Smart Loving. Is that right? Smart Loving Marriage?
Smart Loving, yep.
It was formerly Celebrate Love. Under both titles, I've been shoving people your way and saying, go check out these guys as marriage resources, marriage preparation, but also mostly enrichment after marriage. It's not the only thing they've been up to. They've been, in the past, chairs of the Australian Catholic Marriage and Family Council, and it's an advisory council of the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference, mostly because of their work in this area and the experience they bring to that, but in many other marriage preparation style circles, including the big conference called Renaissance of Marriage, which happens now. This is not so much a general conference, is it? It's for people who are involved in the marriage industry.
Yeah, that's right. It's really a leadership development conference. So
Right.
It's a gathering space for those that are working in the Catholic sector to promote marriage and family at all different stages, whether it's working in schools with youth, your groups in parish life.
I met all kinds of people at these conferences, though. They weren't necessarily professionals in this sphere. They were people who were just really passionate about marriage and they've seen the decline of marriage in their parishes and in their world. They really wanted to get involved.
Yeah, that's right. And increasingly we're seeing more and more dioceses and parishes that are sending representatives from their congregations, their communities, to participate and to be energised in their mission, in their ministry. So it's really, really delightful actually to have those there, because most of the people who are paid to work in this area in the church actually do so on their own. They're often not doing it with their spouse.
Yes.
So it's a real delight to have couples coming as couples
Yeah.
to the conference and bringing all the charisms of their relationship with them.
You said the word alone there, and that's really the case in this area, because you often feel like you're the only one in this area, and there's a sort of a despair that builds up over time. And in some respects, it's been really handy to come across ordinary folk from the parishes, because they still have that earnest desire to do something radical and new, whereas those of us who've worked in the area for some time, sort of, we got to get in a rut. We kind of think this is all we can do, kind of thing.
Yeah, so true. It's. I guess it's natural to bring ambitions and goals and lofty objectives to the work that we do, and we're almost always falling short in some capacity there. So it can be a little bit discouraging, but it's so refreshing to have that energy and that really that innocence about a naivety where they just kind of have no sense of the tragic experience that makes us be a little more cautious or tentative in what we do. They come in with raw enthusiasm, which is really good for all of us, I think, to get a dose of that every now and then.
Speaking of ordinary people having raw enthusiasm, how did you guys get involved in this? Because your backgrounds wouldn't have pointed to this particular field.
We come from a long pedigree. So Byron's parents, Ron and Mavis, introduced Worldwide Marriage Encounter to Australia.
Yes.
Back in the day. That must have been almost 50 years ago now.
Indeed. And they've been stalwarts of especially the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference.
Yes,
and
yes.
other work in Australia in marriage.
Yes.
I think they represented us in the Vatican at one stage, didn't they?
They were 25 years on the Pontifical Council of the Family.
Right.
And so that was every year, I think, almost.
Yeah.
They were back and forwards for that and very conscientious in terms of applying the principles and the vision of Pope John Paul II back down into the diocesan and the national level and the parish level. So they brought Marriage Encounter to Australia. Our families were in the same parish. They recruited my parents for a Marriage Encounter weekend. And they subsequently both were involved with Antioch then. I was too young. Byron was one of the initiators of Antioch into the country. And my parents and Byron's parents were the two parent lead couples.
You were doomed.
I was too young. And so we've had just this long sort of, I guess, pedigree of witness and marriage involvement. My parents prepared hundreds of engaged couples for marriage in our home. So we saw these engaged couples coming in week after week.
But if we looked at it, your formal qualifications, which is unfortunately what most people normally look at. Now, clearly that's an excellent preparation for work in this area, but in terms of what you actually did for a job and formal qualifications up to this point, it doesn't quite match this, does it?
No, I did an undergraduate degree in science, in physiology, so that's very helpful for aspects like fertility and so on. I also studied a bit of psychology. I did a little bit more when I did my Masters of Religion at Fordham University.
Lovely.
So that kind of padded out
Brings
theology.
It all in. Yeah.
Then I did work in then it's been, I guess, self-directed study. Since then. Byron's a PhD in biochemistry, so he's even less qualified, but he is a doctor. That does help.
Indeed.
That magic sort of preface at the beginning of the name does help. It gets him privileged seating on planes and things like that.
They have this mysterious, academics seem to have this mysterious belief that having those letters makes you in some way better able to teach everything. Right.
And he's not unencumbered by self-doubt in that regard.
All right, let's leave that. I'm sorry, I'm being a little cynical here as someone who's engaged in this work of academia. In terms of actually what we're getting involved for and why. I mean, why would we bother getting involved in marriage at all? I mean, it seems to be a very private thing, and there's lots of criticism, for example, about Catholics getting involved in people. Like, keep your rosaries off my ovaries, that kind of slogan, or
stay out of
the bedroom. And what are you celibate people telling us all this stuff? In fact, I haven't heard too many celibates talk to me about the church's teaching on marriage, and
it's like a deathly silence from the pulpit on these issues.
Really,
you don't really hear much at all. The reason why we're really passionate is, well, firstly, is we discern it and we feel very strongly that the Spirit is calling us into this work. And every year around this time we have a revisit the past year, and there's been some years where I really begged God to say, give me something else to do. This is so frustrating. Give me something else. And He keeps sending me back. But I think one of the key things is that the nuptial mystery is so embedded in the redemption story. Like, it goes to the core of salvation. And Christ himself like even in the Jewish scriptures, there's these repeated references to the awaiting of the bridegroom. The Messiah was understood to be a bridegroom that was going to come to the people. And Jesus spoke about himself as the bridegroom. So identifying himself as that long-awaited bridegroom. So it's so clear to us that without a strong marriage culture, the community cannot receive the salvation story fully.
And even in a practical, like almost just straight up and down the line sociological sense, in the health of our society, we know that every person is better off if they have a stable home, a loving and stable home. Now, we need to say that clearly, because just having a mum and a dad doesn't make it a loving, stable home.
That's right, yep.
So what we're talking about here is a loving, stable home, but the most common circumstances where that happens is where a mum and a dad are married to each other and they stay committed to each other for life. Now, there are, of course, exceptions, and it's not to say you have to lock into that, and in every case, even in abuse, of course you're not. We're looking for a loving and stable home here. And to do that, it's not enough to just simply get married.
Oh, absolutely not. And having worked with thousands of engaged couples over many years, you see the whole spectrum. You get couples who are on one hand to be celebrated and held up as being very conscientious and focused on their relationship and their spiritual preparation for the incredible commitment they're about to take. And you get others that approach it with a sense of frivolity. It's all about the party, and we're gently trying to guide them towards, you might want to talk about some pretty important issues that are going to come up for you in marriage. But
it's really hard to talk. I mean, I remember myself before marriage, it's just almost impossible to think beyond that date.
Yes.
It's interesting that when you try and talk to people about preparation for marriage, there's a resistance to it, as if, oh, how dare you question my decision? This is my most sacred decision of my inner. And it's true. It's one of the biggest decisions you'll make, is whether you're going to spend your life with someone. But when a priest fronts up and says, I want to give my life to the church, we spend 7 years preparing them.
Yep.
And we put them through all kinds of rigor, and only about 2/3 of them at most, maybe half, get through that process, because it's a discernment process. I think Kevin Andrews in Victoria, he and his wife run a marriage prep thing, and he said, if we're genuinely about discernment, if we're helping people figuring out whether they should be married, some of them should be able to say, no, I'm not ready. This isn't the time. And given the divorce rates being what they are, you'd have to say that some of them probably should have thought about that at some stage.
Absolutely. And I think there's often once they've made the decision to get married, they've had the engagement party, it's like they're on a high-speed train hurtling.
On rails.
Towards the wedding. And it's really difficult at that point for them to say, hang on, I want to get off, or I need to pause this.
Do those rails start earlier, though? Because if people actually choose to live together, you're on rails already. And so once you get to a certain point, you've been living together for so long, there's kind of, for some people at least, there's an expectation that at a certain point it's easier just to get married than it is to say, hang on, this isn't going where I want it to go, because there's all kinds of readjustment of life and friends and circumstances which has to happen if you choose otherwise. So they just kind of slide into marriage.
Yeah, very true. And in fact, some really interesting research from a fellow by the name of Scott Handley on commitment. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. So he identified two types of commitment. He calls constraint commitment and dedicated commitment.
Ooh.
And constraint commitment is the kind of commitment you get that is I guess, a negative pressure to stay together.
Right.
So
it just costs too much.
It costs too much, and the longer you're together and the more you've enmeshed your life, the bigger those costs are. So if you're living together, you break up, somebody's got to find a new place to live. You've got to sort out who gets which pieces of furniture,
and
who's
going to
take
all that
sort of
all
stuff.
the legal stuff. Yeah.
Oh, you've got to go back into the dating market, and who wants to go there, that kind of thing.
Yep.
So the longer you're together, the more those constraints build up. His cautions, though, he says constraints are not all negative. Like, they can work positively for you because every marriage goes through ups and downs, and sometimes it's the constraints that are the only things that can keep you together.
Right.
And so it's not all negative. They actually have a positive function as well. The dedicated commitment is the sort of the stuff that comes from those, I guess, deeper or higher values in ourselves. It's the decisions we make for the future of the marriage. So valuing, the future of the relationship, and being prepared to make sacrifices for the other person.
But also investments in the future.
Yes, long-term thinking, and those are the hallmarks of a dedicated commitment. And
so when I was in marriage office in Melbourne, people used to ring me all the time because there was a requirement that you had to go and do marriage prep before you got married in a Catholic church. And they'd say things like, what's the cheapest and shortest marriage preparation we could find? And I say, well, there's this one for $110 over there. And, you think I've just spent $40,000 on a wedding. Do you think I've got $110 to spend?
Yes,
and I, rather rudely apparently, would say, well, the marriage is one day and this is an investment in the rest of your life.
Yeah.
So surely it's not that big a deal. Anyway, they didn't usually appreciate that.
We've had many conversations along those lines, usually frustrated, after we put the phone down. Can you believe it? So one day I actually suggested to a bride who was complaining about the cost of the course, I said, okay, look, that's okay. Just give us 10% of what you're spending on your shoes. There was silence on the end of the phone. She no doubt was spending, a couple of $1,000s on the shoes or something ridiculous. And
well, which tells, and the fact that she would never even have thought to question that tells us exactly where our society is putting the values. It's something we were talking about before we came on, is that if some people in the Western society, not all, but some, have started to view marriage as if it's like a capstone project, as if you get everything else in order first. I mean, there's people I know who won't get married because it will cost them, they think, this many tens of thousands of dollars, about 50 to 60 grand some of them are talking about. Apparently the average is over 40 now.
Yeah, that's right.
Just insane. And if they're trying to save up for a house, that's not a realistic investment. Now, the fact that they could do a marriage much, much cheaper than that is not on their radar, because it's a social thing that we have to reach this sort of...
And often girls particularly have been dreaming and planning. Like girls as young as, 12 and 13 have got their Pinterest boards, which has got all their wedding pins. They've got their dresses and their flowers and their table arrangements.
Because everyone wants to be a princess.
And their colour scheme. And so to kind of walk away from that dream that they've held and nurtured for such a long time is a really hard thing for them to come to terms with.
It's interesting, though, that in such a cynical society, and people are prepared to live together and ignore the ideas or ideals of marriage for, that have been around for centuries, they're still holding out for the dream. There's still some kind of element of it. And when I was a minister back in the Lutheran church, we had a beautiful little Gothic revival church. It looked like a church. And we would get constant people coming up and saying, can we use your church? Can we use your church? And you'd find out they're not religious, or they're part of a church that meets in a warehouse. But when it came to the wedding, everything had to look churchy because that was the ideal. That was the image they had in their heads.
Look, and that's true even in the Catholic sector within the Archdiocese of Sydney, where we are. There's about 3 or 4 churches that get something like 80 to 90% of the weddings. And they're not all parishioners. They're mostly coming from different parts of Sydney.
That's not a bad urge, though. I mean, we might talk about the proper preparation and maybe it'd be better if they had a better understanding of marriage before they got into it. But the actual urge to look for that kind of ideal is not a bad thing.
That's right. I mean, beauty, we're naturally attracted to beauty, and that's part of where we can discover and find God. And it's one of the ways we give praise and glory to God is by using our gifts to create beauty and to appreciate it. So it's a good instinct. The
beauty here, even though they're talking about dresses and church building and stuff, the beauty that they're reaching for is actually a beauty beyond that into the ideal of marriage, the actual ideal of that soulmate idea. I'm a little bit cynical about the Disney version of romance because I just don't think it exists, and when people delude themselves into this idea. Romance is self-sacrificing love, and it's ugly usually. Last night it was me getting up at 2 when the young lad was screaming his head off, and I was trying to save my wife a little bit of sleep. And that didn't appear in any Disney channel that I've looked at, but that's actually self-sacrificing love. It's actual love. Buying my wife flowers is actually easy to do. Yeah. But now that I've said that, she's going to be listening to this saying, well then, where are the flowers?
Go, Susan. Yeah.
So there'll have to be some on the way home tonight. But that's easier than getting up in the really messy times or cleaning up whatever the kids have made a mess of or whatever. So I'm suspicious of the attempts to Disney-ize, if you like, marriage and relationships, partially because I think we're a little bit guilty of this when we want to restore a healthy understanding of marriage. And we say the theology of the body that John Paul II's brought us to, the incredible goodness in self-giving love and the goodness of our bodies and the goodness of genuinely good physical relationships and intimacy. We want to restore that rather than a sort of an antidote to the prudish view of Christian marriage, which has come from Protestant angles, some Protestant angles, I should say. But in doing so, we're sometimes guilty of idealizing it too much, saying when you get married, everything's going to be wonderful and beautiful and exciting. And
in fact, we've had conversations with lots of couples over the years. Sometimes, in one case, I'm thinking of they weren't engaged yet; they were discerning marriage,
right?
And they were beautiful couples, fully immersed in the theology of the body, were living the church's teachings to the best of their ability. They were chaste and so on, and they were really struggling because they'd had an argument. And they thought that meant that they weren't intended for each other.
Oh, my goodness, we're not perfect. Oh, dear.
And we've had couples on the other side of the wedding who have come in and they've had an argument and they're in crisis because they think we've made a mistake. We kind of try to explain to them, say, look, you're not living in the Garden of Eden. That we're human beings, we're a work in progress, that marriage is really the call of marriage is a pathway to holiness. It's about refining us. And if we're not experiencing a little bit of tension and friction, we're probably not growing either.
No.
And it's really, we like to turn it around, the whole argument thing. We're not saying that it's a good thing to have these terrible shouting, abusive. But when there's stress and tension and we're getting on each other's nerves, that's actually growing pains. We should embrace those as calls to sort of develop our character and our virtue.
So I used to ask people in marriage counselling, how did you solve your first argument? And if they said we haven't argued, I go, oh, we'll come back when you've had an argument and we'll talk about this because it's not so much that how you avoid arguments, but it's how you actually move through them and grow together in that resolution. And of course, just to be clear for listeners, we're not talking about any kind of violence or manipulative or abusive or even this sort of passive-aggressive kind of violence that happens with words. We're talking about here actually having a disagreement, expressing that frustration in a constructive way. Sometimes it doesn't come out perfectly, but basically that you can actually wrestle with that problem, come out the other end with forgiveness and love, which it builds on that. I gave a talk once at a youth conference which was on marriage, and I led with the line, marriage is the hardest thing you'll ever do. It will take your whole life to get it right. Maybe.
I love that.
And it is also the greatest thing you'll ever do. It's the most rewarding and beautiful and wonderful achievement you'll ever manage in your life, it'll be messy and hard, and everything about your life should focus on doing this first and everything else is a peripheral. I was taken aside by the youth leaders who were quite upset with me and a couple of nuns who were at the conference. You're going to put the young people off marriage. And I said, I hope I put some of them off marriage because they're not ready.
Yeah.
And basically, that was the flattest response I've ever had to a talk. The least, clapping, the least involvement. They were quite distressed about it. And yet it's the one talk that keeps coming back to me. 10 years later, I'm still getting people contact me who've been married in the meantime and have come back and said, I remember you gave a talk and you said marriage was hard. Can we talk? And basically it's that's the only place they've heard someone say marriage is a good thing, but it's hard. Because often people say it's too hard, give up.
Yeah.
On the other side of it, they say, it's wonderful, it's wonderful. You have to kind of put on this sort of Stepford wife kind of exact, perfection, or it's disaster. And when they've heard someone say it's actually hard, but it's worth doing, it's not a common message.
No, it's not. And we've often a similar kind of message, but we'll phrase it that the culture tells us that marriage is supposed to make us happy.
Yes,
and
it's true, but just not in the superficial happiness they're talking about.
Yeah, and we'd say it's not supposed to make you unhappy. But if you think that marriage itself will make you happy, well, firstly, happiness is an inside job.
Yeah.
So really the way I react and perceive the different circumstances in my life determines my internal happiness much more than the actual circumstances
Because if
itself.
my happiness is someone brings me a beer every day and then I get to sit and do my own selfish thing every day, I'm going to be a moderately unhappy person no matter what happens.
Because the beer will be too warm or whatever, it won't be the brand you like or whatever it has to be.
None of those things actually fulfill what I hope in a genuine marriage.
Yes.
Because the genuine soulmate sort of idea, and I hate using that because it's been commercialized and all, but basically when you have a meeting of persons and a genuine exchange of self-giving, that's not the way it works.
Yeah.
And the thing that makes us truly happy in a relationship is when we're able to give ourselves to someone else and they receive us as messy as we are.
Yeah.
And then we receive them as messy as they are, and it becomes something more beautiful than either of us could have been by ourselves.
We like to take, because the soulmate idea is such a strong feature in our culture, such a sort of an epic goal.
Yes.
Rather than kind of dismiss it, we'll say that, look, you don't find a soulmate, because people have this idea that if they just find
the perfect person.
The person, the one that they're intended to be with,
riding over
everything
the Facebook horizon
everything will be
on
easy.
his white horse.
And it's not so much about finding a soulmate, it's about becoming one. And we become the soulmate by journeying with each other through the triumphs and the difficulties and the challenges and the arguments and everything else. So we grow into soulmatehood. We don't discover them. We don't find them.
Exactly. In fact, that's probably one of my pet hates with the Disney culture.
Yeah.
Because the idea of someone just across the horizon, realistically, we probably have only about a couple of hundred people we can meaningfully interact with at any one time. And if we're in a situation, these days the internet gives us the illusion that we're always going to discover someone new, and I'll look outside my social circle for the possibility of finding someone interesting. But if you're in a village in the old days, the options for your marriage were pretty much who you grew up with, and usually you'd make a pragmatic choice based on those circumstances. People have sometimes asked me, "How did you know that your wife was the one?" And I said, "Well, she said I do." And I did too. And if they say, "How did you know before that?" I didn't know. I mean, I had a very good, all things considered judgment on it, and I knew this was the best decision I could make. And frankly, the main reason I got married to her was I once contemplated living without her, and it was horrible.
Yeah.
I really wanted to spend my life with her, but there's no way you can know. What you have to do is actually be that person and be the soulmate.
I had it relatively easy. I had a spiritual experience that made it really clear. I don't get many of them, but that was one of them.
Right. Well, see, it's typical. God knows how we work. But in my case, had he got a beam of sunlight come out of the sky and hit me, I still would have not paid attention. But I actually thought about breaking up with my wife. And as I was thinking that through and how that would play out, I went, why am I doing this? She's my best friend. And I'm trying to think of the ways she could stay my best friend. No, this isn't going to work. This is not going to work. I'm not going to be able to deal with this. And that realization was God hitting me around the head going, hey, You've got the good thing here. Stay with it.
We sometimes get couples that are maybe already engaged and they've got some doubts and they're not sort of sure, they're looking for some clarity. And one of the things that we've often suggested, and it's been remarkably successful, we suggest they pray a novena.
Right.
And what's really interesting...
Sorry, for non-Catholic audience, what's a novena?
So novena is usually... there's lots of different forms, but it comes from the word 9.
Right.
So it's 9 days or 9 weeks. Usually we suggest do a 9-day novena and it might be dedicated to a particular
So just to be clear, it means you pray a very short prayer for 9 days in a row.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Pip. And so they'll pray this novena, but what happens over the course of that 9 days is that they get in touch with their deepest longings.
Right.
And so by the time they get to the end of the 9 days, they know what they want the answer to be, whether it's a negative. And often there is some really clear clarity around a symbol or some kind of gesture. So I'll tell you one, if you don't mind, I'll tell you a story.
Go ahead, yeah.
So this couple, a lovely couple, a more mature couple, and she had some doubts. So she was praying the novena. She was a doctor. And she said she came home on the 9th day and she still didn't have an answer. And she had this history of 4-leaf clovers that she told God, I need a 4-leaf clover. That will be the sign. So really specific.
Gideon and his fleece.
And she said, I got home from work at 9 o'clock at night. She said, I got to my apartment and there's this little patch of lawn out the front. And I'm in the dark with a torch looking for a 4-leaf clover. And I couldn't find one.
Right.
And she said, and I was devastated, absolutely crushed. But she said, I had this sense of clarity that I really actually did want to pursue this.
Right.
And so the absence of the 4-leaf clover didn't dissuade her.
Right.
And in fact, a week later, she was visiting family down in Canberra somewhere and she's on the lawn with her niece sitting on her lap and puts her hand out and bang, there's the 4-leaf clover. So she got a 4-leaf clover and she got a confirmation, but a really interesting interaction of faith and, in her life of
Just
her
to be
cooperation in it and also God responding.
I'm going to be a little bit cynical here as an ex-Protestant, now Catholic, and just about everything actually. I'm a little bit cynical about looking for such signs, the saying, God send me a sign thing. Now, having said that, God has sent me signs, and perhaps it's because of my cynicism that he has to hit me around the head with a board when he does so. But I guess I'm trying to push against people who are looking for a divine sign to absolve them of the responsibility of making their own decisions. So when a young man's considering a vocation to the priesthood, they often want some kind of beam of light from heaven to tell them this is God's will. And you say, well, God's will was to give you free will. Mm-hmm. And one of the key things about a vocation is it's a call, not a demand.
Yep.
It's a call to something beautiful and wonderful. And that call means that you have to be free to commit yourself. And if God's demanding you do something, that's not freedom anymore. He can give your common sense and some signs, etc., could contribute to that choice, but it still has to be your freedom. And when you do commit it, there's no one else to blame. And I think that's partially what people are afraid of. They realise the seriousness of the commitment they're about to make, and they're almost begging God to take away the responsibility from having to make that choice because it's my choice. And so many times in the marriage, we're celebrating 25 years, not so long ago. And I was thinking back, so many times I've come to just think this is really hard, in fact, too hard at some stages. And then I thought, I made this call. I made this decision. I knew it was going to be hard. Buckle down and follow through with the will.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, and I could be way off beam here, but I've often reflected and thought, our first task in the spiritual life is to learn obedience.
Right.
To learn obedience to God's will.
To God, we'd just like to put that out, not to your husbands and wives.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, obedience to God.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then, but God doesn't want us, that's a kind of a childlike trust and faith that was, whatever you want, God.
Yep.
I think he also calls us as we mature spiritually to go beyond that.
Yes.
And to enter into a co-responsibility with God so that we're jointly discerning. It goes right to the heart, I think, for couples when they're discerning whether or not to have a baby or another baby.
Yep.
It's not just whatever God wants. I think God actually calls us to enter into a dialogue with him and to think about
even at the very
partnering
beginning,
with him. Yes.
Even at the very beginning, Adam and Eve were co-creators with God.
Yeah.
They were involved in naming. Adam's involved in naming the animals. Who do you name? You name people you've been involved in creating.
Yeah.
We name our children, but even marriage without children is still a creation because it's the center of society. The life and love that comes from that relationship ends up forming and contributing to society in ways that nothing else can. And then the children that are raised within that community, we know that's the best way to form good citizens, good people, good, healthy people.
The caveat on that, though, is that it really is a mature spirituality. If you haven't learnt obedience first, well, then it becomes, well, what do I want? I just do whatever I feel like. Yes. That's not necessarily a holy way or a good way to live our lives.
So if I put a counterpoint to that, there's two different ways to, if you like, absolve yourself of this will that's required. One is to go, I'll do whatever I want. So my will presumes everything. So if my wife wants this, we're going to fight over this, or we're going to come to a kind of a contract. I'll give you what you want in this if you give me what I want in here. And that seems to be what a lot of people fall into. There's kind of a trade-off. Whereas the other flip side is, and this is the one I'm kind of reacting against, is as if it's all God's fault. I've kind of give up and say, if things don't go right, and I'm very guilty of this, where are you, God? Why isn't it working out? I've ticked all the right boxes. Happiness, please. Why haven't I just been gifted happiness? Whereas in fact, as you said, happiness is very much an internal project. It's something that starts in me, and gratitude for what I have rather than resentment for what I don't have.
And interestingly, the same principles apply within the marriage relationship as it does in our spiritual life. So I can just kind of say to Byron, look, whatever you want, and then it's your fault. I'll resent him and hold him accountable whenever anything goes wrong. Or I can say my will rules here, my way or the highway. Yeah. And neither of those are a healthy way to run a marriage. It's not a healthy way to
and even the little bits, sort of the little ways we do this. So, sometimes my wife will say, you make the decision and I'll blame you. She says it out loud.
Well, she's owning it at least.
Yes. And okay, well, fair enough. That's clear. It's a kind of an in-joke we have. And then at other times I'll just go with her call because it's something I'm not that fussed about, and I'll just go with her call and say, well, that's what you wanted. But that's not a healthy mechanism, because even when we disagree, if you're engaged in a conversation, you genuinely put your reasons on the table, and then we go, okay, well, this is the call we are going with. We both own it, even if I might have had slightly less emphatic conviction about something. Right, yeah. It's our thing.
We have a little process that we teach on our Engage course, and increasingly in our married courses now. It's a process for making couple decisions.
Okay.
And it's interesting that there's not much about this. Like, you get a lot of literature on business decisions, win-win and all that sort of stuff. We call it values-based decision making.
Okay.
And the principle is really simple. It's whenever you've got a disagreement, it's not about the topic. It's about the values that you attach to your point of view around that.
Right.
So say you're an engaged couple and you've got a disagreement over how many guests to have to your wedding. So we can speak straight into what they're dealing with right then and now. The argument's over who's going to be on the guest or how many guests are going to be there. There's often a whole lot of other values it's not about the number. It's not about, what number should it be. It's about what are the values. So someone might have a value for a smallish wedding where they know everybody there and it's intimate and they feel connected with all their guests. Somebody else has got a value for this is an important social and extended family event, and I don't want to hurt anybody by excluding them, and so they've got values around those kind of social acceptance. Well, both of those values are good. And if we connect on the values, they can each reach out and embrace the other's value and find a solution then that honours both values. So that doesn't necessarily have to be a compromise in the middle. It might be that they're going to have two different events. They're going to have a big engagement party and a small wedding, or a small wedding and a big baptism for their first child or something like that. Whatever that might be that they do, they can embrace those values and come to a decision that actually is a true couple decision where neither of them feel compromised. So if you wanted to call it something else, it'd be a win-win-win because we'll say to them that the core value is actually your unity. It's not about...
I would go with you on that and say the core value is unity, but there are some things about my family history which are actually not healthy.
Right.
And I need my wife to actually call me on and say, that's part of your family. And this happens in couples. You don't need to force this, by the way.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Your spouse will tell you, I don't like that about you, what's coming from your family. And you need your spouse to actually have a fresh pair of eyes and come in and say, I see this coming from your family into you. I don't like that, and it's not healthy. And sometimes that hurts because, and this is what you were saying about, it sounds like it's a condemnation of me and my history is my family of origin. That's a huge thing in relationships. Stuff that I have assumed is normal because I was raised in that area and that become my normal is critiqued from outside, and that hurts because I love my parents and I love my family, and anything that's supposedly wrong with them, I'm instantly defensive of. But I need that fresh perspective, and I need to actually be open enough to go, I can still love my parents and realize, that's not healthy. Yeah. I now perhaps need to take something good from another perspective and change my way of doing things.
Yeah.
So,
and sometimes it's just different. It might not be necessarily healthy or unhealthy. It's just this family did it this way, this family. So I'll give you an example.
And this compromise is important there.
Our marriage has been very contentious because of the process by which we make decisions. So in my family, very organised. You get the information, you make a decision, you lock it in, you get organised, right? Reduce stress, reduce complications, simple, get it done. Byron's family, they keep your options open.
Right.
So he often says...
Hang on, does he keep his options open or he just doesn't like planning?
No, he keeps he's playing the options.
Okay.
He's and his dad's very much along those lines.
Right.
It's like, well, if you don't need to commit yet, why would you? Right. There might be a more optimal.
Don't close the doors.
Don't close the doors.
Right.
His mum, he'll say, is as anxious about decisions. So she's happy, even if she makes a decision, she's always second guessing it anyway. So I drew this picture, which my mum dug out. They were going through their stuff, and they gave it to me the other day, that I drew when we were engaged. And it's a little stick figure of me in the middle with my arms outstretched on either side, and Byron and his family on one side saying, keep your options open, and mum and dad on the other saying, can you please make a decision? We've got to book a reception centre. And we only had a 6-month engagement. We didn't commit to a date for 3 months. It was going to be the Saturday or the Sunday or maybe the week after. I kid you not. So it's been the story of my life, this sort of in between these two tensions, and every decision therefore becomes an argument about how we're making the decision, but not just about what the decision is.
It's very much in my marriage too, is I prefer not to bind myself to particular arrangements. Mm-hmm. I do it in my workplace. I'm very organised, but when I get into my space, I like to have the freedom to wake up and go, I think I'll go and play soccer today, or I think I'll go and do some shopping, or I'll go and just sit and read a book.
It's your spontaneous side.
Possibly, but I know I have some friends who organise their free time because they would feel very uncomfortable if it wasn't organised. Mm-hmm. And so when I travel, I prefer just to make it up as I go along, and my wife gets very, very nervous unless I have booked every step of the way. And so the compromise we've come to is that we will schedule time which is non-organised time, where I don't have to have a plan, but it's planned that I don't have a plan. So
whatever works for you, Peter.
Indeed. It's just... I mean, when I'm in work, disorganisation is pain in a business environment, so you have to be organised. But when I'm relaxing, I can't do it to a schedule. I just don't like it. But having said that, her family will sit at the Christmas dinner table and plan next Christmas. So,
oh goodness,
yes, I'm not in that zone, and I find it. I like to just relax and have a family great Christmas dinner, but when we're planning next Christmas, this is their idea of fun, and they feel happy about this, whereas it winds me up. Having said that, let's talk a little bit about, there's small differences in marriage which are easy to overcome with decent communication and problem solving, but we have to look at the reality of some people are actually in quite destructive marriages when people either aren't mature enough or they're hurt from their past, or even the marriage itself so hurt that they get to a point where it's so mutually destructive to be together that they can't actually exist in the same place without hurting each other constantly, and so they separate. I'm torn about this one because separation is too quick to be diagnosed by our marriage doctors these days. and there's almost no way. It's funny. Sometimes I feel like I'd like to say to people, look, just it's time to take a mature pill and actually just grow up a little bit and say, all right, we have to start from scratch. We have to start over, forgive these things and move on. But when the hurt's too big, you get to a stage where what do Catholics have to say in this situation?
Well, a couple of thoughts. Firstly, that recognising the reality that sometimes a marriage gets into such a state of toxicity that we're constantly triggering each other.
Yeah.
And we're so reactive that we can't think rationally. In those circumstances, I think a period of controlled separation, not a trial separation, there's a difference, but a period of controlled separation so that we're getting away from being triggered all the time to give us some emotional space to deal with our own stuff.
But the point is there, you say control, because there's built into that separation an actual mechanism for working through the problems?
Working through the problems and eventually with a goal to eventually reuniting.
Right.
A trial separation is kind of like a different sort of thing where we say, hey, it's not working out. Let's pretend to be divorced and see if we like it better.
And when you've been constantly at each other and it hurts so much in a relationship and you separate, of course it's going to feel slightly better.
It's going to feel better because you're not triggering each other all the time.
Right.
So that's kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, whereas a controlled separation should be done in collaboration with a therapist or a counsellor who can help mediate. And you need to think through the terms. So who's going to move out? Where are we going to live? What about looking after the children and our shared responsibilities?
Yep.
What are we going to do during that time?
Yep.
What are the rules around how often are we going to see each other?
Yep.
Are we going to date each other again? What actions are we going to undertake for our self-healing and so on? So
they need some advice on that because if you're in that state, you're not in a good state to make a decision.
You need to have a professional to help you navigate that.
Right.
It's not going to be the sort of thing that you can just, you can't stand to be in the same room with each other. How are you going to facilitate that negotiation? So
or even want to.
Exactly. So, and we've worked with couples. Actually, they were both had individual counsellors, and he had some addiction issues. I think it was marijuana, and they might have had 4 children, or they had a 4th one on the way, and they'd had this sort of period of controlled separation. And now they were looking at, okay, we're ready to come back together again. We've got his addiction under control. What's going to be different about the way we reform this marriage going forward so that we don't get into trouble? So they had referred them to us, and we spent a number of sessions with them to teach them some specific skills around resetting their relationship patterns. And I think we could do with a lot more of that in the Catholic community, this sort of collaboration between the professional counselling and the marriage education. And particularly I think, I guess I default in marriage education. I mean, technically anybody can teach relationship skills, but I think there's a certain power that comes through when a couple does it.
Right.
Facilitates it together because they're bringing the witness of their sacrament. You're firstly getting the masculine and the feminine perspective, so you've got balance on that. But you've also just got the charisms of the sacrament. Their relationship is being lived out before the client couple's eyes.
Right.
And so they're getting that role modelling, but they're also experiencing the love of God that inhabits the space between them and experiencing that, like you're welcoming them in, particularly if you can welcome them into your home. Yeah. That's sort of like the domestic church. I've often said that, it's a bit like the difference between, meeting a couple in their home. It's like going to see the animals at a zoo versus seeing them on safari. You see them in their native habitat. It's a different environment where, there's their children and their unpaid bills on the counter and all that sort of stuff that's part of married life becomes part of the ministry that you're bringing to this.
So what we're talking about there is that the important role that even non-professional, and this is key for all our listeners here, there's a professional role of there's quite a lot of training and skill that goes into facilitating dispute resolution and those sort of things, but there's a huge role for ordinary Catholics to play. If we get into this subject area, Francine, we're going to be going for another whole episode. In fact, would you be willing to come back for another episode and talk about the practical things that ordinary people can do in?
Oh, absolutely. One of our favourite subjects. And I might even have Byron in the country at that time. So you can have both of us.
That would be lovely. Absolutely. But that's enough for this week's episode. We'll come back to this in another episode. Today's discussion got you thinking, arguing with your podcast device? Let us know. You can subscribe to the podcast at thiscatholiclife.com.au or on any of your podcast apps. Tell us what you liked or what you didn't like. at info@thiscatholiclife.com.au or Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Discord, or any of the places you can find us, or look at the show notes on our website for details. Remember, this is a uniquely Australian Catholic podcast, and we think that's a great idea, an idea worth getting behind. So tell your friends. Time for a shout-out. Francine.
I've got two couples I'd like to shout out. One's a couple just newly married last week or the week before, Nick and Shakri. And the other is a couple we're preparing for marriage. Again, another Nick and Genevieve.
Lovely. So. I'll shout out to my own wife, who's put up with me for 25 years, and that's some task. That's all for now. Thank you for listening to This Catholic Life.